Hello and welcome to the Liberal Reform Leadership Q&A. My name is Tom Morrison and I'll be chairing tonight's event. It feels like an absolute age since the leadership campaign finally kicked off, but I'm absolutely delighted that both our candidates here and looking full of energy. So thank you very much. That's a good start for both of you. Before we start, I'd like to thank Liberal Reform for organising the event and to my two co-chairs, Callum and Andy, who will be overseeing chat on Facebook and YouTube. To find out more about Liberal Reform, please visit liberalreform.org.uk or find them on Twitter and Facebook. The organisation exists to promote personal liberty and a fair society, supported by free, open and competitive markets. So please get in touch if you want to know more. As stated, I'm delighted that both Layla and Ed are here with us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. To outline the event, we're going to have three broad topics for the candidates to discuss. Firstly, we've got housing, then we've got economy and welfare, and then the future of the party. First, though, we're going to start with opening remarks from each candidate with no more than 7 minutes, and we'll be then moving to questions where a first question will be asked for each candidate, and they'll get up to 5 minutes to answer, and then we'll have around about 10 minutes of supplementaries, and then we'll be off to the next topic. We won't end this time on a candidate's elevator pitch tonight, as I'm sure they're both very tired of giving the same things over and over again, and it gives us more chance for a bit of discussion, a bit of back and forth. So without further ado, can I ask Layla to start your introduction? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on this summer's evening. I'm really delighted that you're here, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And the values that Liberal Reform promotes, personal liberty, a fair society supported by free, open and competitive markets, are an important cornerstone of the liberal philosophy. And I'd like to start by saying that as leader, I want to encourage you to continue to develop your ideas and to put forward bold new proposals in our debate. Because we Liberal Democrats are a party of ideas. In fact, Paddy Ashdown used to say that we're at our best when we're fizzing with ideas. So let me encourage you to fizz. There is a wealth of experience and opinions in all parts of our party's internal organisations, and I want to support it. And you may be aware of the Build Back Better book that I edited and published in June. 40 party members contributed their ideas and proposals to it, and it took over 2 months to produce, and it's now available for all to debate. I'm sure Liberal Reform could put something similar together, and I would love to come and debate its contents with you. It's not just about if we agree, it's more about if we listen to each other when we might disagree. This leadership election is an important moment in our party. It's taking place at a time of real crisis for our country. In the wake of Brexit, in the midst of a pandemic, and there will be pressures for the British people to turn inwards, to try and shut out the world, which our current government tells them is the source of all its troubles. Under my leadership, I want the Liberal Democrats to be unashamed promoters of internationalism, of a country open to the world and to the free movement of people, ideas, and goods. The party has always had a belief in the international approach at its core, and I grew up in many different countries. We moved to Belgium when I was 1, Ethiopia, Jamaica, Jordan, Greece. It's one of the reasons why I'm a Lib Dem. It's one of the reasons why I consider myself a liberal. And when Charles Kennedy and thousands of Liberal Democrats marched against the war in Iraq to uphold the rule of international law, that was the first march that I ever went on, after frankly spending most of my teens and 20s not being that interested in politics. But now I'm not just interested, I have a fire in my belly. More than ever, the country needs our liberal vision. It needs us to demonstrate how foreign policy matters to every single citizen every day. It matters on trade, on health, on climate change, on security. And in this way too, we can point out the benefits of working as closely as possible with our neighbours in the European Union, laying the foundations eventually for the campaign to rejoin. But we also have to address bread and butter issues that really matter to voters on the ground. After the December general election, I went door knocking in parts of the country that did not elect Liberal Democrat MPs. And I heard from them what really matters. And the vision that I have created as part of my leadership campaign is based on those conversations. And what came up was housing, crime, public services, education, jobs. We have to show how Liberal Democrats would address each of these topics, listening to voters' concerns and critically rebuilding trust and support. We need to paint a positive vision of a country after coronavirus. It's tough times out there, but that chink of light, that sliver of silver in the clouds is where we should belong, showing how we can use the opportunity of these gigantic upheavals to build a better society and not just return to business as usual. To build a society that is more equal, where people are valued for the work that they do, where they have access to high quality public services, affordable housing, and a more generous welfare system. To have an education system that from cradle to grave makes sure that every single person has the opportunity to learn, appreciate, discover, and thrive. And opportunities for training and reskilling that allow workers to change jobs and careers as old industries disappear and new industries are born in the wake of the technological and zero carbon revolutions. An entrepreneurial society where businesses of all shapes and sizes are encouraged and supported to invest and innovate. My experience outside of Westminster, particularly when I was one of the key members of the board in a social enterprise, have helped me to inform my understanding of a small business. But what I also recognize is that government needs to set that framework, but it can't micromanage. And we need a democratic society where government serves local communities, where powers and resources are decentralized to local government, and where decision-making is open and transparent, and government cannot stamp on dissent and evade scrutiny. I believe that I am the best person to paint that liberal vision and paint it in a way that resonates with ordinary people. I've demonstrated in this leadership campaign with over 400 pieces of positive media that I can get the cut through that is necessary to grab the headlines, but every time doing it in a way that rebuilds the party's profile and shows people what liberalism is. My campaigning vision of education, the environment, and the economy was informed by voters and is already getting serious cut through in every single part of the United Kingdom. And I know how to take the fight to the Tories. I won my seat, Oxford, West and Abingdon, in 2017 against a huge Tory majority, and then held it with a massively increased majority, the best in this seat's history for any candidate and any party. But of course, I recognise too that we also need to take the fight to Labour in councils that are mismanaged and the communities that they ignore. And we need to rebuild trust again so we can start winning again across the country. From the grassroots, winning mayoral elections, council wards, entire councils, so that people can see that on the ground, why it makes a difference to vote Lib Dem. And the reason, of course, is because when you vote Lib Dem, you get Lib Dems. And when you get Lib Dems get stuff done. And that's how we're going to win back credibility. But to win, we need to listen to campaigners across the country and support them at winning at every level. We need to make implementing the general election review a priority. And its findings chime strongly with what I've heard in listening sessions that I've held with over 300 local parties all across the UK. There has never been a more important time for a reinvigorated Liberal Party. We need to hold this disastrous government to account. We need a leader.
I ask you to wrap up, please.
Who voters can believe in. Vote for me and let's move forward together. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Layla. Ed, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Friends, these are challenging times. With the worst recession for 100 or even 300 years, COVID, Brexit, the climate emergency. Our economy and our society are being hit hard. I'm the leader for these challenging times. I bring both vision and experience with liberal solutions to tackle today's huge challenges. Take the economy and climate. Too often they've been separated. My Green Economy Recovery Plan combines these challenges to invest in green homes, green transport, green energy. And I can deliver this green economy vision because I've experienced doing it before. I fought the Tories on climate and won. In government, I more than trebled the UK's renewable power. I combined strategic state intervention with private sector investment, innovation and competition. A right-wing Tory let the market rip approach would have failed. So would an approach of nationalisation and left-wing state planning. My liberal mixed economy approach actually worked. And now the price of offshore wind electricity has fallen from £160 per megawatt hour per unit of electricity back in 2012 to less than £40 per megawatt hour just 2 years ago. And Britain now is the world leader in offshore wind. Liberal Democrats, we can be proud that we've the best climate change record of any party. But a future greener economy must also be fairer. That's why, as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, I use competition to keep energy prices lower. Before my policies, the big six energy firms had over 99% of the market. Following my pro-competition, pro-small business reforms, the big six market share fell to under 70% and it's falling. And for consumers, that's kept prices lower than they would have been and improved customer service and choice. And a fairer society is why I'm proud to have abolished the default age of retirement and stopped employers being able to sack people just because they reached the state retirement age. My government work on shared parental leave, on reform of competition policy, on collective purchase, on post offices and Royal Mail. All of that work applied market-based thinking for progressive goals, liberal economics for a fairer society. In this leadership election, one of my big issues, which I will want your help with, is the caring agenda. COVID has shown people the importance of caring to the NHS, and it's shown people how the care sector is underfunded and how people are treated poorly. It's also shown how the care agenda isn't just about how we care for the elderly, but how we care for people with disabilities, for the mentally ill, for the bereaved. And my political proposal to the party is this: post-COVID, let's be the voice of caring. Let's be the voice of carers. The UK has 10 million carers, 3 times as many people who voted Liberal Democrat in 2019. Not just care staff, but the millions of unpaid carers. This is an issue I can lead the party on with some knowledge and authenticity. For my own caring experience, started as a young carer. Dad died when I was 4, Mum became terminally ill when I was 12. So I nursed her for 3 years till she died. Brought up then by my grandparents, I ended up as the family member responsible for my grandmother's care for over a decade. Now Emily and I care for our severely disabled son John, who needs 24/7 care. So I do understand what so many carers go through every day. My own life experiences help me relate to people, to voters, to their challenges. And I want our party to come up with radical new plans to reform all aspects of care that will win over millions of votes from carers and from the cared for. Now, in the general election review, you see our party's many challenges. And the conclusion: there are no quick fixes. Despite what some allege about the way forward, repudiating the coalition isn't a recommendation in the review. But the sharpest criticism of the review is compelling and awkward. The review says people don't know what voting Liberal Democrat means. My vision begins to try to answer that: a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. And my top task as leader will be to work on honing our message, to translate that vision into a winning election campaign. And friends, we can win many more seats. And while it's not all about the media, I do get quality media cut through. Like after I forced a commitment from Boris Johnson for an independent inquiry into COVID. When I was on multiple broadcast channels, including the BBC 6 and 10 o'clock news. And my experience over 20 years up against the toughest interviewers of our times means, you know, I can punch through when it counts. Above all, though, I'm an experienced campaigner. I'm the only MP in our party's history to win without being a target seat. I took on a seat with a notional Tory majority of over 15,000 and won. Then in 4 years had built it into a Lib Dem seat with a majority of 15,000. And I will bring that campaign experience to win for our party. First, I will build the Liberal Democrats as a strong independent party. And I do want to defeat this awful Tory government. So yes, I consider informal understandings with Labour to do that, just like Paddy did. But I will keep Labour at arm's length. No pacts, no joint campaigning forces. Because if we did that, we wouldn't win over those moderate Tories whose votes we need. Friends, while times seem tough for our party, remember the first nationwide election under Paddy Ashdown? We scored less than 6%. I remember how Paddy led our rebuilding. Paddy appealed to the moderate Tories we needed to win. And I'm the leader best able to appeal to those moderate Tories today. From my economics and business background to my political experience. From my life experience to my greener, fairer, more caring vision. Back me as leader, and I'll win over those moderate Conservatives, and we will win again.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. Right, we'll move on to the questions now. These questions have been gathered by Liberal Reform, and as I said, we picked them into three different sets of categories. First, housing, economy, and then the future of the party. So we're going to kick off with housing. I'll ask a question, and then each candidate gets 5 minutes to respond, and then we'll move to a list of supplementaries. And if you could keep your comments brief during the supplementaries, that would be fantastic. We can get through as much as we can. So the first question, and Ed, if you could answer this one first. The housing crisis is one of the greatest challenges our country currently faces. It traps individuals and families in poverty, reduces productivity, and perpetuates intergenerational inequality. How will you ensure more houses are built for those that need them?
This is a crucial question. It's the question of our times. I've been doing advice surgeries in my constituency for 20 years, and housing has always been the biggest problem. Homelessness, poor housing, young people unable to find somewhere to live that's affordable. So I agree that this is a priority. I've been working at it in the party for some time. I actually met my wife, Emily, on a Liberal Democrat housing policy working group in 2003. So I probably have SAD tattooed on my forehead. But Emily and I talk a lot about housing, and she's now the housing portfolio holder for Kingston Council. And she's regenerating a whole council estate, building better council houses, more council houses in a mixed development that's going to be zero carbon and more accessible for disabled and elderly people. And looking at what Emily's doing at the local level, I know this can be done. I know we can build more houses. It just requires better political leadership and a clearer vision. Here are some of the solutions that I know Emily's been working at that I think we can translate across the country. First, and this may surprise Liberal Reform, we do need state intervention. Now, if you look over 30 or 40 years at housing starts, the private sector's tended to build 100,000 homes a year, plus or minus, but not a lot more, not a lot less. And it's only when the state sector builds or supports building the next 100,000, the next 200,000, that we really begin to get things going. And that does need investment, but it does need much more focused support from central government and local government, empowering local government, using public sector land. There's huge amounts of public sector land that's going to waste, particularly in the NHS and the defence. We need to get that land being used for housing. We also need to make sure that the planning system captures the value of planning decisions. And no, it doesn't just give it to developers and private investors. Some of it will have to be shared, yes, to create incentives. But a lot of that could come back to the local community. And if you did it in a sensible way, you would encourage people to be willing to accept more house building in their area because they could see the benefits to them individually and to their communities. And that's a critical issue, capturing the value of the planning decisions that increase the value of land. I'd also want to make sure that we were doing this with a reformed subsidy system. The housing benefit system isn't working, and the universal credit version of it isn't either. I think we've been subsidizing rents, often for very poor landlords, when we used to subsidize the bricks and mortar. I want to look at that again, because I think subsidizing bricks and mortar could be more effective, a better use of taxpayers' money, and actually get things done. My final comment on this, Tom, is not only have we got to think radically about this issue, but we're going to have to think afresh again post-COVID. COVID, I think, is going to change a lot of things forever. I don't know how much, I don't know exactly when, nobody does. But we all sense, don't we, that Zoom and other video conferencing platforms are going to change the way we travel, the way we work, where we work, when we work. And to me, that's going to mean that our cities, take the city of London, are we really going to expect people to be traveling in like they've been doing over the last few decades on crowded commuter trains into high-rise office blocks? I don't think that's going to happen in the future. And it's going to change the way people operate. It's going to change the use of the current built environment. It may be we'll need a lot less office space. It may be we'll need homes in different places. Already internet retailing was changing town centers. And I don't think as a party or as a country, we've looked at that opportunity that that gives us. Actually, it's a huge green opportunity, repurposing existing buildings, refurbishing them for different uses. And I want us to be the party that really gets onto that home working, changed working lifestyle. Because I think it'll be popular. I think people won't want to commute quite so much. I think they'll want to change things. And, you know, if we could have exciting town and city planning with really well thought through housing, you know, that could really lead the way. So, Tom, really interesting agenda, great question. Looking forward to debating it.
You're on mute. Sorry, Layla. So this, I'm living my life saying that to people, and I just have it happen to me. So, Layla, same question to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I mean, first of all, a personal anecdote. I personally recognise the thrust of what this question is asking. I live in Oxford, and it took for me to become an MP with an MP salary, with help from mum and dad, buying the house with my sister in order to afford a two and a bit bed semi in a suburb of Oxford. You know, this is a very real issue. And the point that was made in the question about there being a real intergenerational divide, I feel very keenly. And there are those younger than me, including my own brothers and sisters, who feel that actually they won't get to the point where they are able to even start to afford their first houses. And we have to address this. But in order to address it, we have to first recognize that there are multiple housing crises. It's not one size fits all across the whole country. There is one in London. There's another that is the halo around London, of which Oxford sits. But if you go north, and I've spoken to many campaigners in the north of England who say that when we are talking about the housing crisis and rising and spiraling house prices, there are parts where you can't offload a house It's not the same there. And there is not one size fits all. So where we need to start, as with all liberal things, is to go back to one of our core liberal tenets, which is localism. The power to build houses needs to sit first and foremost with empowered local government who are able to work with developers of all sizes, not just the big developers, but I also keep hearing from smaller developers who want to get into this and are unable to do so. To reform the national planning policy framework, I have a lot of sympathy for. I just don't trust Robert Gendrick. I don't trust the Tories to do this. They have shown themselves over and over again to be untrustworthy with this. And you just have to look at the fact that the big developers in our country are sitting on planning permission for 1 million homes. It's already been granted. They're not building it. So we need to radically shake up this system. But I'm not convinced that the Tory way of doing this, which is to allow basically a free-for-all of permitted development, is the way to do it. Because what it's going to deliver is potentially houses, but are they going to be zero carbon houses? And actually, more than houses, what I'm obsessed with is creating homes and creating communities. I'm really proud that the Vale of Whitehorse District Council, the Lib Dem run Vale of Whitehorse District Council, has some of the highest rates of house building in the country. And what frustrates us is when developers come back and say, well, having negotiated in the initial planning permission that X amount would be a truly affordable housing. First of all, it's not truly affordable, because in the Southeast, 80% of market value is very, very difficult to get on the housing ladder with. But secondly, that they then, reduce the number of homes that are starter homes, they increase the number that are executive homes, just to be able to turn that profit. And this is where we need local councils to have much more of a say, much more empowered. We have a system that's joined up where you don't have infrastructure on the one hand and then housing on the other. A system where local people work with local councils and developers to deliver housing. I'm a big fan of local plans for this reason, because what you do is you turn the question on not if you should have houses or not. It's when you have houses, what are they going to look like? What infrastructure are you going to have with them? Where are they going to go? We need to change the conversation around it. But the last thing I'll talk about is social housing. As many of you may have seen, I've championed the cause of the homeless ever since being elected as an MP. The Vagrancy Act was brought to my attention, in fact, by a bunch of students here in Oxford who pointed out that it is a criminal act to sleep rough in this country. And that piqued my interest, and I learned more and more about it. And one of the key reasons why people become homeless is private tenancies that then go wrong, but also a chronic lack of social housing. And I would like to see our own party that's already committed to 100,000 new social homes a year being built to match the figure from Shelter, which is 155,000. There is no better way to show how much we care than to have zero carbon, well constituted homes for the people who need it the most vulnerable in society, to explain what liberalism is, and making sure that there is not a single person in this whole country who needs to sleep on the streets at night. It would be transformative.
Can I ask you to wrap up,
life
please?
chances. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. So I think that's sparked quite a bit of debate. Thank you both. And it seems like Facebook and YouTube have got a couple of things going on now. Someone's just raised a really good point with us here. That I think this is the point you've said there about local plans and kind of getting councils to work with developers and empowering councils. That's great. And I think we all agree with that. However, how do we encourage Lib Dem local councillors to not reactively oppose to housing in their local areas? Because there is a political balance here and there is a kind of a need for housing. How do you kind of match those up? Ed, if I could go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, two things on that. First, in Kingston, I feel it particularly relevant because my wife is the council in charge of housing, and we know we need to build a lot more houses, a lot more council houses, and a lot more houses generally. and Emily is spearheading that work. And it's amazing what you can do if you are looking creatively, both at brownfield sites, at increased densities. That does mean building sometimes higher than has been done in the past. And it also means looking at land that has been left by other public bodies, and particularly mentioned the NHS before, and not being used. And we're looking at partnerships with Kingston University, partnerships with some private developers to really change the pace of building here in Kingston. Some of it will be controversial, but I genuinely think we are going to be able to do far better than has been done for the last 20 or 30 years. Already we've given permission for 950 homes on a brownfield site, which previously Tesco's wanted to build a Tesco's on, superstore, and I opposed successfully for nearly a decade. And we, rather than having a superstore, which we don't need, we're going to have 950 homes. And I'm really excited about that. It's a brownfield site. On the Cambridge Road estate, which is a very big council house estate, we're going to be doubling the number of homes there, building more social homes and building zero carbon homes. So it can be done if you have imaginative localist solutions. The other thing I would say is, if you look at different policy ideas, I've always been attracted by those ideas that turn NIMBYs into IMBYs. People who don't want it in their backyard, and suddenly they do want it in their backyard. In other words, using incentives. Now, the current system, the Section 106, which we're all used to,
okay. Actually, to wrap up a little bit there, Ed, because I just want to bring in finish that thought.
The wrap-up line is this. There's a policy which has been debated in the party for some time called community land auctions. Community land auctions. I'd like us to look at that again.
So Layla, same question to you then. How do we balance kind of the political necessities of our councils and that housing need, and how do we encourage our councillors to kind of be a bit more kind of proactive in kind of getting housing?
Well, first of all, I'll come at it from my own local area. We here have both opposed and encouraged more house building, depending on the situation. And what we have always tried to put in the front of our minds is actually that there is a balance to be struck between getting the developers to build in the first place, of course. And I think there should be more local councils being able to build. We're actually looking at setting up a housing trust of our own here in the Vale, because we recognise that not enough is being done. We want to do even more than what we're doing now. But that there needs to be that balance between the houses being built, where the jobs are, respect for the natural environment, and also the amount of affordable and social housing. And it's all of these things together that need to be taken in the round. So, for example, when there was a Oxford local plan that went through, and it's now passed through the planning inspector's hands, in that particular local plan, I argued for more housing, more than 2,500 more houses to be built in the centre of Oxford. And the reason why I wanted that was because the plan as presented by the Labour Council was actually about attracting more and more businesses to be built there. They liked that because it increased their own business rates. But what it would have meant was increased commuting between the suburbs and the centre of the town itself, which is not in the interests of either those people who need to make the commute, or indeed the town that is trying to become a zero carbon town. It's not what's needed, and the infrastructure just isn't there. Meanwhile, when people have suggested building on the Greenbelt, by the way, I'm not adverse to building on the Greenbelt. I just think that there needs to be a coherent and publicly minded debate about the whole of the Greenbelt. The piecemeal development that we're seeing now, which eats away at biodiversity, is not the way to do it. We need a coherent plan for this. And so where they were looking to build on the Greenbelt was where those extra houses that were not going to be built in Oxford were going to go. And so I argued to decrease the amount that were going to be built on Greenbelt to increase the amount that was going to be built in the centre of Oxford. And I'm delighted to say that the inspector agreed. And so now there's going to be more houses built there. But alongside that has to be money for infrastructure. And that so often is the main reason why councillors object. They often aren't actually objecting to the houses themselves, but they quite rightly raise issues around GP surgeries, schools, cycle lanes, transport links. How do we make sure that we are building communities that are coherent? So if we can encourage councils to take that joined up approach, to have local plans that are ambitious, and that is why, you know, I think when we've had manifesto commitments of building garden cities in greenbelt areas in the southeast, for example, I've supported it. I think that's the right approach. But the approach that the National Planning Policy Framework takes right now encourages NIMBYism, because those other peripheral things, the bits that make houses into homes and communities, are so often missing. And councillors are raising those objections. Let's take a more joined up approach, and I'm convinced that that will make us build more houses.
I think both of you have said, the two key words there for me is, both of you have said communities, and we've referenced kind of building these kind of communities. And Ed, you mentioned COVID, how that changes the whole landscape. Now, I think if we go back to that time in March when the lockdown really kicked in, kind of the really kind of heartbreaking stories that I found were those people that didn't have green spaces, didn't have, they were in kind of smaller flats and stuff. Now we've seen that there's a very top-down approach that the Conservatives are starting to push through with delivering housing. Do you think they're going far enough to helping those people? Or do you think this is just about getting more houses regardless of what that type of housing is? Ed, do you want to go for that?
Well, we've seen no evidence that top of the Conservative concern are the less well off. It does look like a charter for developers. And my biggest concern is that it's going to cut out local democracy and local communities. You know, they'll come in at the first stage and then it'll be too late. Then, you know, the idea that lots of people are going to get involved in the ethereal nature of a plan without any particular application is a nonsense. We all know that. It's only when there's an application that people can begin to see and feel. And I think this will be a disaster myself. And there are alternatives. You know, we're seeing Liberal Democrat councils using local plans very proactively and including lots of new house building. My proposal I was beginning to touch on, community land auctions, was an idea that we debated in the party some time ago, sort of got lost in the thicket. I'd like to review it, because it's one of the ways where you can get local people suddenly saying, yeah, we'd like some more houses in our area, because it will mean that we'll have, you know, a new sports hall. We don't mind that development over there because it'll lead to a new school and new facilities here. And it's just a different way of approaching planning, which gets more local people more into it. And there's another approach called planning inquiry by design. And inquiry by design is a new approach that's being taken by some of the more advanced thinking architects and planners and developers that bring in the community right at the early stage and allow almost the community to design the development. This is a much more liberal approach, and it's one that I think we should support.
Ted, and so Layla, same to you. Do you think we've how are we going to deal with those challenges that we saw at the beginning of March, particularly with the lockdown and in this kind of post-COVID world?
Thanks. Well, we saw this in Oxford, and I'm, you know, very pleased to live in a part on the peripheries of Oxford where literally 3 minutes that way, I've got a big field at the end. It's a wheat field, by the way. I've never run through it, but it's there, and it's lovely to walk there. And in fact, coronavirus has, I think, reasserted, certainly for myself, a real strong sense of place, a sense of how important green spaces are. They have been my lifeline at points when it was just all getting a bit much. That hour's walk a day that we were all almost mandated to do or encouraged to do, I really appreciated. And along the walk, you'd be able to talk to your neighbours, you would look after each other. That sense of community, very much a part of who we are as a party, I think was reignited. And through coronavirus, I do see a more community-minded approach. But I'm also very well aware that in another part of my constituency, in a place called Cutslow, where you've got much smaller houses, or indeed in the centre of Oxford, in parts of Oxford East, where you just have to go 10 miles and life expectancy drops by 15, 20 years. those houses, those multiple occupancy houses that we have rogue landlords here, they have not been served. And I've seen it in the work I've done as education spokesperson. The idea that there are children who have a study or even somewhere that they can have a desk, it's often the poorest children for which that is a nonsense. And let alone that their parents would then be able to work several jobs. And actually there's also a disparity between who can work from home. I mean, it's lovely if you can, but for those who are living in cramped accommodation, who've got children and who are manual workers or frontline workers, they have to go out. And so the coronavirus, as with so many economic depressions, which is what this is eventually going to turn into and already is arguably, tends to affect the most vulnerable. And that's why I'm so passionate about high quality social housing. But I also think that we should be thinking to the future. And one of the ideas that I've put across is that we need a committee in Parliament, similar to the Committee on Climate Change, but that looks at what our nation needs in the future. What is our world and what is our society going to look like in 20, 30 years' time? Let's get ahead of the problem rather than what we now do as a country, which is the problems build up, the change happened, we didn't recognize that it was even coming, and we didn't plan for it. Now is the most important time, in my view, where we have this opportunity to think ahead. What is society going to look like in 20 years' time? And actually, it is very likely that home working is going to be part of it. I very much hope that roads are not as much a part of it. People have appreciated what it means to not have to do that commute, what it means to have less air pollution on their streets. But let's design homes that are high quality and think ahead to what we are going to need as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So that wraps up the housing section, and now we're going to be moving into the economy and welfare. Layla, I'm going to start with you, and the question to both of you is what are your views around greater intervention of the state in already highly regulated markets, such as gambling, the sugar tax, and the unit pricing of alcohol?
Thank you. I'm just writing it down so I can answer them all.
No worries.
And alcohol. So my basic premise is that where you need to start with all of these things is the individual. As best you can, make them aware of what choices they have. And the first instinct should not be regulation. But having said that, and I'll take each one in turn because they are slightly different. With alcohol, actually, I have, in my own heart of hearts, not liked the idea of a minimum unit for alcohol. It tends to be regressive, as much as, yes, reducing alcohol consumption would improve public health. And you could argue the same for the sugar tax, but again, there's a part of me that says, actually, this is just not fair. And as someone who struggled with my own weight, and I was obese for most of my childhood and into my early 20s. I had a bariatric operation. I lost half my body weight. To introduce something like these sin taxes and then just assume that that's going to solve the problem, it's so much more complicated than that. The government's obesity strategy just doesn't seem to understand, first of all, the intricate link between being obese and mental health, between being able to have access to the great outdoors, in line with the questioning that we've just had before about how important green spaces are. I've been challenging, as education spokesperson, the sell-off of school playing fields, because if you're going to have a healthy nation, it starts there. And it starts with a well-resourced NHS and education. And if you can encourage people through those forms and they then fail, then by all means look at something else. But I know that this country has not gone far enough in those instincts. And it's always going to be a fine balance. And I can understand why people reach for this, because it feels like it's the easy thing to do. And it's worked with cigarettes, which actually, frankly, I agree with. But I don't agree with it in terms of alcohol and sugar tax, because the difference between cigarettes and, well, alcohol's perhaps slightly different, but with food is that you can't stop it. You can't stop eating. And so you've got to give people that choice and educate around it and give them the support that they need. Gambling, I have a slightly different view of, simply because we know that it has caused untold harm, and it has been allowed to proliferate, and it has gone too far. And the way that we see gambling adverts on football shirts at football stadiums, that we have not got to grips with this. I'm glad that actually in the last Parliament there was moves on all sides of the House to regulate this more. I do think that there is more regulation that needs to be had, and that some of the tactics that they have used, frankly, are shameful. They have found the very people using social media and their habits, the ones who are most likely to be addicted, and then fed them more free bets. They have perpetuated the negative behaviors. And who doesn't like a flutter on something every so often? I will occasionally on a horse now and then, but it becomes a different thing when it starts to eat away at your family finances, your mental health. It often will lead to greater things that are themselves very difficult to deal with. And I know this because there are members of my family, sadly, who have succumbed to this. And if there was more regulation in the way that those gambling companies operate and the way that they are able to specifically target the most vulnerable individuals, then I think that is the right place for the state to do. So let's, as a general approach, assume a hands-off approach. But when there is evidence that we need to act, boy, should we act, because it's the right thing for all.
Thanks very much, Layla. And Ed, the same question to you.
When we consume different things, they can have different impacts on ourselves and on the wider community. And as liberals, we normally want people to be free to make the choices for themselves. That's the John Stuart Mill approach. We believe in freedom. The question, though, is when that freedom of consuming something has impacts on other people, either directly or indirectly. And when we then decide to intervene, either through regulation or taxes of some sort. And I come at this from my experience of the smoking ban. If you remember, Parliament banned smoking in public places, in pubs and restaurants and cafes, after many years of debate and discussion. I was one of the small number of Liberal Democrats who voted for the most of the ban, but kept a little bit of freedom. What I said was, and it was called the Railway Carriage Amendment. And the idea was if you'd gone into a railway carriage where there were only smokers, and only smokers would go there, and employees would not have to go there. It was just for smokers, like a smoking club, just for smokers. I couldn't see why one would get rid of that freedom of those people to smoke. And so I went to 95% of the ban and voted for lots of it, but I voted unsuccessfully for an amendment to keep that freedom for smokers who want to smoke with other smokers and not harm anyone else. And that's the sort of approach I would take on many of these issues. However, when you go through the list of things that people consume and you look at, shall we say, the externalities of people consuming something, actually it can have quite big externalities on other people. I mean, obviously smoking is an easier one to talk about, but and so is things like, use of fossil fuels that put carbon dioxide up there and cause climate change. But those externalities even exist in things like food and sugar in this context, and gambling, and indeed alcohol. The impact that can have on the individual can impact the rest of society. So it's legitimate, it seems to me, for society to say, where is that line between the individual's freedom to consume whatever they like and the impact on society? And it's a difficult one for liberals, and I accept that. But the idea that we shouldn't do regulation and some taxation on gambling seems to me nonsense. Gambling can lead to huge damage for individuals. We know the harm, and the harm that has on their families, their work, the whole society. And I'm afraid I could be a bit illiberal on that. I think I would still defend the freedom of people to gamble. Absolutely, I'm not sort of Methodist-like in some opposition to gambling, but I do think there's good liberal grounds for intervening. The sugar tax is a trickier one, But the problem that we have as a society, and there's no point wishing it away, and it's particularly a case in the UK, is we've got an obesity crisis. If you look at the public health issues, you've got air pollution, you've got, well, tobacco's actually beginning to be tackled much more successfully in recent years, thanks to the ban. But actually, obesity is becoming a massive issue. And I would never have thought that Boris Johnson, who decried the nanny state loud and clear for many years in many articles, has suddenly become the nanny state personified. His near-death experience, perhaps, persuaded him that maybe people did need a little bit of an extra helping hand for the good of themselves and for wider society. So I think as Liberals dealing with these issues, we do need to think quite creatively and quite hard. And I think some of those understandable Liberal concerns about being too nannying does need to understand the externalities. And that does apply to alcohol. I've not yet been convinced of a minimum unit price of alcohol, but I think we do need to keep stuff like that under review. I don't think it's a matter of absolute principle. I'm an evidence-based politician, and I want to see the evidence about the harm, who's being harmed, and what the benefits of different strategies might be. It may be you can do it through education. Fantastic if you can, and better education. But maybe that's not always possible. And therefore, I think there's legitimate room for government intervention. I don't think we should be a party that eschews regulation and public policy intervention.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm going to stay with this idea of a regulated economy for the time being, because it was one of the kind of the big topics of the last general election. Well, it was minimal next to Brexit, but it was one of the big topics. I'm interested in your thoughts on like natural monopolies. So let's take the water industry, for example. Can you ever see yourself supporting like a renationalisation of the water sector in the UK, or in England particularly? And Layla, I'll go to you first.
Well, my general approach to such things is, and I think this is very much a Liberal approach, let's look at how it's delivering on the ground. And if that is working, then, do we need intervention in the market or not? Well, it just sort of depends. I know that there is a nationalised water company in Northern Ireland. And the impact of that there is that actually water costs quite a lot of money, but they really like it. It's very popular politically. They don't want to change it. When I went over to Belfast, we had quite the ding dong about it. And I just thought, is that something that we might want to do here? And actually we don't. Because the thing about water is that you can't then get cut off. There are legislation in place that say that you can't turn off the taps. And so because water is so important to life, frankly, that you do have a situation where there is a sort of pseudo market that is there with actually natural monopolies in different areas, but ultimately it is working. And so I'm not inclined to renationalize for renationalization's sake. However, when you have markets that are inherently failing, and actually a really good example of this are the different train franchises. There are some that are working fine, and there are others that are utterly failing. And what we've in fact seen is Grant Shapps de facto renationalising some of the rail franchises because they simply are not delivering the results that they were meant to in the first place. So it's very much horses for courses. I believe that there is a place for the market, and in fact that should be the default, but where there is a case for more robust intervention from the state to make sure ultimately, and this is the bit that obsesses me, is the consumer getting what they need? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you then ask yourself the question, is the market working? If the answer to that is no, very often you need to change the regulator, you may need to change legislation that's around it, and you may need to in fact include it in legislation to make sure that it's something that is included for everybody. But if then it doesn't pass the test, then there is a space, I think, for the state to intervene if it is something that people absolutely need.
Thanks. Ed, same question to you. Could you ever see yourself backing something like that?
No, I mean, my background, as many people know, is an economist, and my degree, and then I put myself through night school at Birkbeck to do my postgraduate in economics. And I've looked at the debate between privatization and state ownership an awful lot over many years. And I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion that the state is not a very good operator. You know, raising private capital, managing that, the financing of it, employing huge numbers of people, planning big infrastructure projects, billing lots of people. It's just not very good at that. It's just, you know, even in countries where there is state ownership, it's not really fantastic. Now, that's not to say that privatized utilities are fantastic. Far from it. Some of them are awful. But you then have to ask the question is, how can you improve them better by putting them in the state sector, or better by better regulation, or by introducing competition? And my experience, both as a constituency MP, dealing with some of these natural monopolies and dealing with their regulators, and indeed in the energy sector, which I know well because I was Secretary of State, is that the real way to deal with the problems is by the government deciding either to toughen the regulations, give more powers to the regulator, or introduce competition where it's possible. So take water. You know, I think Ofwat's not been a great regulator actually, and although our water industry, partly thanks to European regulations actually, is a relatively high performer, and the number of complaints and the relative costs it doesn't do that badly on. I think there are aspects, particularly environmental aspects, which I'm not happy with the water industry, and I want to give Ofwat more powers to intervene. And you know, when you talk to the water companies, they go, well, okay, we get that, and then we'd have to adjust things, and we'd have to have a discussion, and it may impact on what we can do, but you can have a proper, open, transparent discussion with it. I think if you nationalize it, you get a really bad result. I don't think it would be as transparent. And I think people fail to understand that through really heavy monitoring and auditing and regulating of the private utilities, you can get a more transparency. Now, let's be clear, this hasn't always happened. And I'm not some sort of Panglossian, the best of all possible worlds. You know, I think you do have to watch these companies, and I don't trust them. And it's one of the reasons when I was Secretary of Energy and Climate Change, I used competition, because I didn't even trust a regulator to get it right in this context. What was happening was when I came to office, we had the big six. I think I talked about this in my opening remarks. They had 99% of the market, or slightly more, and the smaller companies find it really difficult to get in. So I did a lot of work on barriers to entry to see whether we get more of the smaller companies coming into the market, competing, providing better service, providing better prices. And we did that. And we didn't use regulation, we used competition. And we really shook up the retail side of the energy market, the supply of heating and electricity to people's homes. And the market share of the big monopolies reduced dramatically. So I guess, Tom, there's different solutions to different problems, but I'm very nervous about the state suddenly owning it and running it, because the evidence that I've seen as an economist isn't that encouraging.
Okay, thanks for that. And just to stay on the same, we've had a couple of people message about this particularly. Both of you, I think it's fair to say, both of you have said that, you know, if you were to become leader, you'd be open for kind of discussions on working with other parties in terms of policy and kind of issues. I don't want to kind of step into it, but I'm correct in saying that both of you have said that. What if Keir Starmer's Labour Party carried on with their kind of nationalisation agenda? How would that affect you as leader of the Liberal Democrats in that relationship with the Labour Party? Layla?
I think that would make it more difficult. And the mood music from the Labour Party is that they are becoming more centrist, more moderate. I would very much hope that they stop some of this. And the problem I always had with the Labour approach, and particularly the ardent sort of socialist approach to this, is that the assumption was that the mode of delivery, the state owning everything, equal access to everybody, everyone's outcomes the same, is going to deliver the best society. And I've never believed that. In a sense, my view as an educationalist, as a teacher, was always, I'm going to give you every opportunity that you can have. But if you want to then not use any of it, that's up to you. It's up to you if it's something that you don't want to then use. And the problem I had with the way that they were approaching this is that their view was to renationalize everything, that was somehow going to fix everything. And I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for 3 years. This is not sexy at all, but it was a really interesting apprenticeship in how this works. We were looking at big government contracts, things that usually went wrong, that were worth £100 million or more. And actually, the state is very, very bad at doing some of this stuff. The civil service itself very often doesn't have the expertise to even set up the tenders right, let alone then make sure that the projects run on time. And this is a big problem that we have. So we need that expertise that now exists in the private sector to make these things work better for the consumer on the ground. So long as Liberals, we continue to think about those voters, you know, knock, knock on the door, it's the Liberal Democrats. What do you really care about? All they want to know is, does it work? Is it affordable? And can I guarantee that you are getting value for money as a consumer? That's the thing that has obsessed me.
Right. Okay. So Ed, the same question to you. If Labour carried on with their nationalisation kind of drive, how would that affect any kind of future discussions you might have with the Labour Party in terms of linking up with policy and campaigns and things like that?
Tom, I've done a lot of negotiating in my life. I've negotiated in Parliament with opposition parties, with government ministers. I've negotiated in government with civil servants, with the Tories. I've negotiated the EU. I've negotiated the United Nations. I've negotiated in business, and I even now negotiate with my little daughter. That's tough, I tell you. The thing I've learned about negotiations is you go in with your piece, your picture, what you want, and you don't give a hint, a nano hint, at any stage beforehand that you're going to give in on anything at all. And I'm not going to give in 4.5 years on an internal party debate on any policy at all. I'm going in any negotiation with the Liberal Democrat manifesto, expecting to get 100% of that manifesto, period, full stop, that's it. And you know what I'd say to Keir or whoever? I'd say, you didn't really want this anyway, it's crap. Look at the evidence. You don't waste lots of time and energy and money, Keir, messing about with this. Blame it on us. Tell your momentum left wing to, well, I was going to say a rude word there. I won't. Tell them to go away. Tell them to go away very nicely. And just blame it on us. And he'll probably go, fantastic, thanks, Ed. That's just what I wanted to hear. So, you know, let's not get ahead of ourselves, but let's talk about us, not the other.
Okay, well, that is a fantastic segue, Ed, because the next set of questions is going to be on the future of the Liberal Democrats and with you as a leader. So the first kind of question here is, if obviously one of you is going to be the next leader of the Liberal Democrats, and I think it's fair to say that this campaign has, on one side, you could say it's energized people, but on another side, I think if you go to certain areas on social media, Facebook and things like that, it's probably become a bit grim for few people. I'd like to know, if you were elected leader, how would you bring the party back together? And Ed, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
Well, first of all, I think this would be a lot easier than people think. I think people look at Twitter and think that's the party. It isn't. The vast majority of members are not on Twitter or on Facebook, and they've taken no notice of a lot of stuff that's out there, actually. So that's my first point. Let's not get overworried about this. That's not to say we shouldn't take it seriously for those people where tempers have got a bit higher and feelings seem to be running high. The first thing is how Layla and I work our relationship, which I think will be absolutely fine. I think we'll manage that, and that will give a lead in of itself. You know, if I'm leader, Layla's going to be in the top team, right? Layla, in case you didn't know, that's what's happened. You're in the top team.
Back at you.
So, you know, I think that will send a signal. And if you look at some of the issues that people have got hot under the collar about, I don't necessarily, they're not ideological as far as I can see. They're not the splits that you see in the Tory party or the Labour Party. So I think they can be overcome. And I'm very happy to reach out to people who haven't voted for me, who have concerns about me. I think those concerns are overdone. And, you know, we are a party that is actually much more united than people think. And they blow up the disagreements because there's not that many. So I don't think I'm complacent about this. I just think that's the reality. And having been in the party 30 years and been in Parliament 20 years, I've heard lots of people say, oh, you know, the party's split, and it's not. We'll come together because we know we have a job to do. We've got to rebuild our party. We've got to get secure foundations. We've got to start winning elections. When you start winning elections at local level and so on, you get into a virtuous circle. Your opinion poll ratings start picking up, etc., etc. And that's what I'll be focused on, laser beam like. And I think that will bring people together, campaigning against the Tories or against Labour, whoever's the opposition where we're campaigning.
Okay, thanks very much. And Layla, same question to yourself.
Yeah, well, in terms of, and I completely agree with Ed, in terms of our own relationship, I'm absolutely will offer my support 100% should I not make it, and vice versa, I hope. And we are 11. And also the wider party itself always finds a way of coming together. And I hate selections. I always have, whether it was to be selected for Oxwab or other seats that I was selected for before, because it feels like infighting in the family. And people pick sides and then they find points of difference. But actually, as many commentators have said, there isn't actually all that much difference. One of the things, though, that I do bring to this role that I think is really important in the context of this question is my approach to leadership. I'm first and foremost someone who wants to bring out the best in other people. And that makes me someone who listens and who naturally collaborates, who brings people together, who seeks consensus and cooperation. And it's what I will do in the party itself, at all levels of the party. And my natural instinct is always to look across at what I have in front of me in terms of resources, and to work out then, how do we get the most out of it? How can I empower them to do the best possible job that they can possibly do? And when you do that with teams, and I've done this for the whole of my career, actually that brings people on side, that brings people on board. But the other thing that I do, and perhaps this comes from my scientific background, and I did physics at Imperial, that was my first love. Physics of Star Trek was the book that ignited it all, but that's perhaps a story for another day. But I've always sought different opinions. I like having people in the room who don't necessarily agree with each other. And actually, I wish some of that approach was taken on by, you know, people who get a bit heated online, that actually the other person can also be wrong. The other person, by the way, can also be right. They might just have a different approach. And by having that conversation, you improve your understanding of subjects, you refine the nuance. And very often that is where the best strategic and tactical decisions are taken, is when you encourage that diversity. That is how I operate. That's the kind of leader that I am. And that's why I am absolutely certain that should I win, I will be able to bring the whole party with me.
Thank you. So the next question that's come up here is, and I think this is a really interesting one. It's about, so if you were to become leader, obviously that's not for an infinite amount of time. There'll be at some point where you are no longer leader. What do you think? What would you want to be the legacy of your leadership, Ed?
PR. I want to get PR, and that's critical because it's the key that unlocks progressive politics. And through that, then of course, a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. All the things I'm standing for on this leadership. But if you could get PR, I think that is the way to achieve so many other things. So we won't necessarily campaign on our leaflets on PR. Of course, we'll be focusing on the green economy and all these other issues I've talked about, the green jobs and so on. But every Liberal Democrat knows that our voting system is unfair, is frankly wrong, undemocratic. And if we want to give people the chance to really have their vote count and to have fair votes, then we've got to champion something we have campaigned on for decades. And I think there is a chance we could get this for this reason. First of all, AV, which Labour used to hide behind, that's done. That was lost. So they can't go and hide behind that. They have to come behind fair votes. And if Labour is honest with itself, when it now looks at what's happened in Scotland and what could happen in Scotland, when it looks at the fact that its northern wall has been breached, then it's in real trouble. And I think that trouble is quite significant. And while Starmer's clearly going to do better than Corbyn, I'm not sure he's going to do well enough to give Labour people the heart that they seriously think that they can win by themselves. And therefore, you're seeing in the Labour membership, in lots of Labour chat, a view towards electoral reform that I've never seen in my whole political career. So my objective is ahead of the next election to see if we can persuade Labour to adopt and put in its manifesto a commitment to legislate for electoral reform. And that is going to be I have several obsessions for the party, but that'll be one of them. And then if we, the other side of the election can be part of legislating for electoral reform that unlocks a political system that can deliver the things that we've all campaigned for and desired for many years.
Thank you very much, cheers. And Layla, so what would you want your legacy to be?
Well, I'll start by saying I want to be leader for a while. I think we've had too much turnover of leaders. I don't want to be a short-term leader. I want at least one, ideally two, if not more, general elections, because we need to build that message. But actually, I think that the issue that we face as a party right now is a very deep existential issue. And it's one that the general election review itself refers to, which is that if you knock on a door, and I've tried this in various parts of the country, and these were the conversations that I was having with people, and I was seeking very slow conversation, asking them very honestly. I'm not here to ask how you vote necessarily, although they ended up telling me often, but I said, I want feedback for my party. Tell me about it. And I'd often start with the question, what do you think we're for? What do you think of us? And all sorts would come back. And they'd mention a lack of trust. They'd mention that we'd lost touch. That's why I talk about the bread and butter issues. That's why education, the environment, and the economy are front and center of my campaign, because these were the things that were coming back clearly on doors. But what they couldn't do, and they could do this, by the way, with Labour and the Tories, if you ask them, what do they stand for? They would have an answer. And people right now, particularly in areas that we need to win in, don't have an answer. And so my legacy, I want to be that if you knock on a door anywhere in the United Kingdom, people have a clear sense of who we are as a party. And my ideal thing that they would start to say back to us is that those are the people who fight for my freedom. Those are the people who understand that I know best how to live my life. The job of the state is to help to give me the security to live life as I choose. And that is why we campaign for civil liberties. That is why we champion equal rights, but that is also why we champion strong public services and a welfare state that works. And everything else that we then do flows from that. So let them have an answer. What are we for? And let that answer be something along the lines of freedom.
Thank you very much. And I think kind of just moving on to this, I think there's I think this, fair to say, this leadership election has been kind of dominated around the idea of kind of centre-left and whether, you know, stuff like UBI and housing and things like that. Do you think that there is still a place for kind of economic liberals or I hate the term, but I'll use it, orange bookers in the party? Do you think there is still a place for those people in this party? Ed?
Yes. I mean, I wrote in the Orange Book, my chapter was on local government, and I still agree with what I wrote back then. And economic liberalism is what has been running through our party and our predecessors for 200 years, and it still has answers to the problems we have today. I distinguish for many audiences economics into three caricatures. You've got the caricature of the Labour Party, which is and socialists, where they want to nationalise everything, tax everything, and run everything. Then you've got the Tory Party, who believe the market must be right because that's the market, and the state shouldn't do anything. And where I think we are, whereas we apply practical knowledge, know that the market can provide lots of things, competition can be really good, enterprise can be fantastic, there's nothing wrong with profit. We believe in free trade, but we don't believe that the market is our master. The market is our servant. And that's the economic liberalism that I ascribe to, using the fantastic power of competition market and free trade to deliver the progressive goals we want, whether it's on climate change. So, I've talked about reforming capitalism in the city to pass laws and so on to force investors to do the right thing. When we were talking about regulated monopolies earlier, you can change the rules so you get what you want. And that form of regulated capitalism and the markets as our servant is my approach. And if that's what you mean by economic liberalism, Tom, I'm very much in favor of it. If we were to go reject markets and competition and free trade and say, no, it's got all done by the state, that would be a disaster. Equally, if we said the state has no role and it should not care about things, that would be a disaster too.
Thanks. And Layla, same question to you.
Of course there is. Of course there is. And we are a broad church, and we're a church centered in liberalism. And I found this left-right debate really frustrating, because actually what it speaks to, and it was very often done by commentators and journalists who are trying to put our party on this official axis that actually we don't quite fit, and we never really fitted, because liberalism includes market liberalism, it includes civil liberties, it includes public services. It was liberals, it was Beveridge that came up with the welfare state. It's always been that way. And the reason why we believe in those strong public services and the state being able to intervene in those markets is because fundamentally we believe that individuals should have the right to be able to choose how to live their own lives. But we recognize that not everyone has that equality of opportunity. And that's why the two must always exist together. And I'm proud to have Orange Bookers on my team that have helped to inform some of the policies. And I do think that there is a healthy debate to be had in the party about the balance. And if you think back to our preamble to the Constitution, we always talk about a sense of balance, a balance between communities and individuals in the state, balances between different types of markets. And there are always going to be balances, and there are always going to be shifting. And one of the things I love about our party is that we recognize that that balance is shifting all the time. And liberalism gives us the means to be able to be nimble about that, because it's not picking that left-right axis. It's actually about liberalism, radical liberalism, if you would like to talk about that. But actually the thing that's radical about liberalism right now is that we have been missing from the debate. People don't understand what liberalism is for. And that takes me right back to the question that I answered before, which is what my legacy I would like it to be, is that people out there can start having these conversations on an axis that makes actually more pragmatic sense for how the world really works.
Thank you very much for that. Just to kind of go more, yes, sorry about this, but go into the depths of like party structure and things like that now. This is for the real Lib Dem kind of geeks like myself. Yeah, we're going to be looking at this now. We've had the report that came out into not just the general election, but kind of our campaigning and the way the kind of party is structured. Can I ask, from the kind of so many recommendations in there, what are the kind of the top three things that stood out for you in that? And if you were leader, what are the top three things that you would make sure that were going to happen on your watch, Ed?
Well, the most important thing is, Layla touched on the last question, making sure people know who we are, who the Liberal Democrats are. And that for me was the most alarming finding, although frankly, many of us knew it. And it's the whole set of reasons why people don't know who we are. I think partly in recent times, it's because we focused on Brexit. And, you know, I'm anti-Brexit and pro-European, but I said at the last leadership election, we need to reach out to Leave voters, reach out to Leave communities, show we had something for them. And we did the reverse. And, you know, I remember back in 2005 when we focused on the Iraq war, which, you know, we were right to oppose it, but we didn't tell people at the same time who we were. And if I'm honest with you, the last time we really focused on a brand image for the party, real clarity of who we are, was back in Paddy's day when he talked about the environment and the and education. He actually talked about the 5 E's, but those are his 2 ones that we became known for. And people understood when you're on their doorstep, oh, you're the guys who, and we've not had that, and that's a real weakness for our party. So, you know, I take from the general election review as that as my top task, to work with the party in the team on the messaging so people understand our brand, if you like. I'm sorry if that's a very market commercialized notion, but I think they get the brand of Labour for the many, not the few. They get the brand of the Tories, you know, strong and stable, or whatever. That wasn't always that successful, but you know what I mean. They don't really have that idea for us. We've got to do that. And in doing it once, we've got to then play it on election after election after election after election. And that then is the foundation for individual issues that come up election at each election. But you've got the core foundation of the brand. And, you know, that is the core thing I take from the election review, Tom.
Thanks. Layla, same question to you.
Well, there's huge amounts in there, and actually I should probably start by saying, I mean, I'm delighted that Ed and I are both talking absolutely on the same page about implementing that general election review. It means that by the end of this contest, it's going to have a mandate, and a lot of it is going to be very difficult to implement, because when you've got a party that has had, you know, embedded structures for so long, very often the same people that say, yes, we want to do this, and then realize that it's their place on an executive that's going to go, then that can spark issues. So actually the leader taking a specific interest in making sure that this is implemented and giving it the political life that it needs to show that you care about this and you're going to make it happen is very important. Of the top three, yes, what we are for, I addressed that earlier. And that was why my instinct was to go and speak to voters, because we have not understood where we've gone wrong. The first few months, indeed, I would argue the first year and a bit of my leadership, I want to continue to listen to voters. I'm very well aware that coronavirus stopped me from continuing that process. And actually, the process itself was fantastic and it's very motivating. The kinds of conversations you have would then encourage new activists and new members to come out and campaign, and rebuilding our campaigning strength has to be the second one. But the third is around diversity. Where is it that we are going to go campaigning? How do we finally address the changing culture that we need in our party to fully implement the older dice review, which is mentioned again as part of the general election review, particularly in the way that we don't include going to campaign and hearing the voices of the beautifully diverse country that we live in. And the reason why we have to do this is because it's the liberal approach. It's having everyone who we need in the room, helping us to make decisions, a truly inclusive conference, a way to encourage those from different backgrounds, poorer backgrounds, whatever it may be, to be part of this party. And that allows us then, that gives us the legitimacy to go after those big societal issues that we need to tackle. If we are going to talk credibly about anything to do with, say, racial equality, we are immediately undermined by the lack of diversity in all parts of the party. The parliamentary party is certainly better, but actually that pipeline is missing. And that was a really clear thing that I remember reading that general election review for the first time that came through. It needs to be top priority.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a bit more time, and my co-chair, Andy Briggs, would absolutely slaughter me if I didn't ask this question, because he was very excited when it came through. So Layla, I'm going to ask it to you first and then come to you, Ed. Who is the Liberal Prime Minister that you admire the most?
Goodness me.
I'll give you a couple of seconds
Yeah.
now, I think.
That British Liberal
Well,
Prime Minister.
British Liberal Prime Minister. I'm not going to let you get out of that one. Yeah, it's a British Liberal Prime Minister.
My goodness. I mean, there are liberals who I admire. Obviously, you know, people like Keynes, people like Beveridge, but none of them were prime ministers. I would struggle, and I'm not going to say that I can give you an answer that will make sense right now, because I'm not a historian and I don't know what each of them would have done. The way I approached politics was as someone who was absolutely uninterested in politics, and there are, you know, people who, you know, I would point to, people like Gladstone, of course, who I've learned about over the years, but to pick one favorite, I would struggle. So I'm going to slightly bypass the question, but I'll pick Gladstone for sake of, at least that's one I remember.
That's fine. I'm not Jeremy Paxworth, so don't worry. I'm not going to come at you there. So Ed, how about yourself?
Oh, David Lloyd George. You know, controversial on many levels, but he, you know, he took that liberalism of the 19th century and made it relevant to the 20th century. He you know, introduced, when he was, I think it was Chancellor, he introduced the first ever state pension. And the new liberal thought of that early 20th century, which he was the sort of political, I won't say leader of, but he was very, very, very involved in that. I think he helped that into power. Now, you know, he was absolutely transformative in fighting poverty. He was far from perfect in other areas. You know, so in no way can you say he was without negatives. However, if you look the transformation that he made in our country and what he managed to articulate from a liberal position was really quite striking. And while I'm not an expert on the history of what went wrong in the early 20s, when of course, you know, our party was overtaken by the Labour Party, I think, if more people had followed his lead and learned his intuition about where society was going, I think maybe the Labour Party would never actually have come through, and we would have been a strong Liberal Party during that period, and be even stronger now. But you know, there's no doubt the sheer breadth of his vision and what he actually did would make him my choice.
Well, thanks very much for that. We're running out of time. Just for the sake of clarity, Campbell Bannerman is mine. So open up front there. So I think we're running out of time now. So I just want to say thank you so much to you both. I think I speak for everyone outside is that we are incredibly lucky to have two fantastic candidates to be leader. I think other parties are looking over with envy at this. And I wish you both the best of luck. And I guess we will see each other at a conference bar when we're allowed to at some point. So thank you very much.
Very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Tom.
Yeah. Take care,
Well chaired. Thanks, everybody. Bye.